Shockingly, 80% of containers that get to the Nigerian port leave empty. Experts say this costs the economy about $1 billion annually and highlights deeper issues with non-oil exports. Exporters face high costs as a result of limited infrastructure and bureaucracy that stifle trade. The process of shipping goods is tedious, requiring excessive paperwork and fees at multiple government agencies. Once cleared, goods face delays in accessing scarce dock space and equipment to load ships. These inefficiencies and added expenses squeeze already tight profit margins that discourage exporters. Producers also struggle to access finance to fund operations and trade. Local banks see investing in exporters as risky, charging high interest rates if they end at all. This limits firms' ability to produce at scale for exports, upgrade technology, and meet world-class standards. And to unpack this, I'm joined by Temisan Omatseye, who is the former Director General of the Nigerian Maritime Administration and Safety Agency. Good afternoon. Glad to have you join me. If you can kindly help us on mute, I can barely hear you.
Oh, good afternoon, and thank you for having me.
All right, I can hear you now. It's glad to have you join me. Let me kick off by asking, empty containers leaving Nigeria's seaports represent missed opportunities that Nigeria needs. Why do so many shipping containers leave Nigerian ports empty?
First thing we need to realize is that Nigeria seems to be an import-driven economy. We seem to be doing a lot of imports. But unfortunately, as a country, we have left our core business, which was exports, most especially of the agricultural produce. I'm sure if you remember in the 60s and the 70s, Nigeria used to be a major exporter of commodities, agricultural commodities out of the country. But what has happened basically is that there's been no focus on agricultural production and other things on the inland. And therefore, what has happened now is that a lot of things are being imported, a lot of goods are being imported, but not a lot of goods are being exported. So most of the containers that come in with imported goods are having to be sent back to their home country empty because we're not having sufficient cargoes to put on those containers to send them back to their countries of origin.
Well, indeed, tackling these issues head-on could transform the export landscape and also Nigeria's economic prospects. But then, how do we address the real issues and turn our exports, holes we have in export, into wins?
Well, what is happening right now really truly is the challenge is that people are not very encouraged to do export right now because one, the most important thing, which has to do with the infrastructure. As you must realize, most of the goods that are being produced in the inland. So you take areas like the east where they produce yam or up north where they do a lot of agricultural produce. So there's not a lot of level of processing which allows the goods to be maintained and whatever. But the worst case of this all is the fact that we are dependent on a monolithic port, which means everybody wants to take their goods to Lagos. And many a time, because of the inability to get into Lagos ports, this has actually led to a lot of containers being left stranded or being left, and many of the goods going bad, which has made it totally unprofitable for exporters to carry their goods to Lagos. So we need to begin to think out of the box and begin to think about utilizing other ports. I believe Nigeria very quickly needs to develop an agricultural development port, a port which is specific for agricultural produce. And it doesn't need to be in Lagos. It can be in Warri, it can be in Port Harcourt, it can be in Sapele, it can be anywhere else but Lagos, where exporters of agricultural produce take their goods there, and most of these processes needs to be automated very, very quickly.
Well, you've touched on very key components there. You talked about the level of processing and also containers not being grounded. But then the time it takes to clear goods from Nigeria's seaports compared to other neighboring West Africa countries is very huge, making us lose businesses to them. How can we reduce the cargo dwell time to be efficient and also competitive?
Okay, now, I don't know which one you're talking about. You're talking about the imports or the export right now, so one can actually focus on those ones.
Let's look at both of them briefly.
Okay, the imported goods, what needs to happen very quickly is that we need to get back to a situation whereby we do a lot of pre-inspection of cargoes before they even leave the port of origin. And what that means is that we can identify clearly. If it means we have to send custom officers to the ports of origin and they can carry out their inspection and digitalize this process so that when the goods land in Nigeria, duties have been paid and they're leaving the ports almost immediately. We also need to have a process whereby we have a standard operating procedure for export. So we know those who are going to inspect so that once we digitalize it, the exporters can go on a web or or whatever the case and get a pre-inspection of these goods so that once the goods arrive at the port, because they're already stuffed and whatever, they're just loaded on board the container and are taken out of the country. I think this will quicken the process and will make Nigeria more competitive when it comes to imports and exports of cargoes in Nigeria.
All right. Now, with oil production declining in Nigeria, Nigeria must take action to diversify its economy through competitive non-oil exports by streamlining its processes. Now, what do you think we can do, or do you agree with such submission? If you do agree, how can we begin to diversify?
I think it's time for us to leave to take our eyes off the oil, because oil is becoming a diminishing commodity. And I believe that Nigeria is a very blessed country, especially when it comes to mineral resources. I think we need to go into an area where we need to go more into deeper industrial mining. But that will not solve the problem because Nigeria still lacks the infrastructure to evacuate these goods after they've been mined to take them to a port, a deep sea port where they can be exported. The most important thing is that Nigeria is going to be competing internationally with the likes of BHP, Rio Tinto. Those guys are doing deep, big mining. But in Nigeria, our mining operations will take place in the hinterland, in the plateau, in the Zamfara. And those goods need to be moved in the most economic way from those areas, especially either by rail or by water to a deep sea port where we can use deeper vessels that can carry up to 200,000 tons so as to reduce their cost of freight. With that being done very quickly, that would allow Nigerian goods to be more competitive, because if we're not competitive, we'll not have a market for our end products. But we need to diversify away from oil, focus more on gas, drill more gas wells, build more LNG plants, and also go into a lot more mining and also begin to export more mining like iron ore, tantalite, and all the rest. That is where Nigeria's future lies. No, not, in my personal opinion, no longer in oil. That's my thinking.
Well,
and agriculture, of course.
Well, indeed.
And manpower.
All right. Well, indeed, we do hope we can diversify as a country and also nip the bud when it comes to export revenue loss. Thank you so much for your expertise on the news. Temisan Omatseye, former Director General of the Nigerian Maritime Administration and Safety Agency. Many thanks indeed.